today is a few words about me. I'm Mirwais Parsa. I was affiliated with CGM just before a couple of months, but now I'm working as assistant professor of economics at Seton Hill University, which is just a few miles south of Pittsburgh City. So the paper that I'm going to present is on rent-seeking reform and special influence group. This is a theoretical paper. This is a positive analysis. It is mainly an economic model applying game theory to the context of analyzing the role of influence groups in Afghanistan on how they mold the outlook of society, the form of institutions that we've got, and how that eventually impact the long-term economic development in Afghanistan. It also draws from some other minor countries in Asia, like Nepal and Saudi Arabia, but that part of the literature is not well explored as of now, so that is perhaps a future project. But today I'm going to present only the main theoretical findings. I'm not going to do any model, anything as such. So we all know that around the end of 20th century, the world witnessed two overlapping changes of globalization and colonialization. And those two broad phenomena, of course, left a huge impact on some countries like India in Asia and many other countries, but very trivial on others, including Afghanistan and Nepal, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, that were not colonized, that were not integrated into that global colonial system. And as such, the very endogenous and pre-capitalist modes of production that those countries had that persisted longer, perhaps, it remained saved from the influence of Western capitalist system for a long time. These set of economies, they exhibit, of course, coexistence of often two layers of institutions. One formal systems, rules of the game, which is weak, which is fragile, and then informal rules of the game, which are vast and comprehensive, which sort of rules the vast majority of the society in those countries. And while the linkages between institutions and how institutions impact economic growth or long-term economic development, that is now very well explored in the literature. Asimoglu and Robinson and Johnson work on, the very famous book, Why Nations Fail, is something that's already explored that idea. But if institutions impact economic growth and long-term development, but then how are institutions themselves, determined? What are some of the forces that shapes the nature and the long-term trajectory of institutions in particular context? Now, that is also explored in a lot of Western contexts, but unfortunately not as much in our part of the world, particularly Afghanistan. As I mentioned, those are Afghanistan and a few other countries are, some of the countries that remained largely untouched from the influence of Western capitalist system. So in this paper, the idea is then to see how are the nature and the scope and the long-term development of institutions are determined in countries like Afghanistan, Nepal, Ethiopia, and Saudi Arabia that were not colonized. So that's the very broad objective of the paper. A little bit on the literature. The literature on the power of interest group to sort of shape policies and institutions and political processes in their favor. We have a very long-standing literature on that, which dates back to at least 1970s, when a very famous economist, Stigler, tried to conceptualize this idea of the role of regulators and special influence groups and their impact on the types of policies that eventually governments adopt. And he introduced the theory that is now broadly understood as the capture theory. And in that theory, he simply says that, well, regulator, as it is commonly understood as people who are spheres of the public interest, that is not true. That's simply not true, because those regulators who are trying to regulate industries or the economic side of society, they are themselves captured by those industries. So there's some symbiotic relationship between the polity, the regulator, on the one hand, and the industries that they are trying to regulate on the other hand. So that is, as a matter of fact, not to the best interest of the public as such. Then this theory is being built on by several other economists and political scientists. But then the idea which links the theory of interest group to the idea of the paper that I am doing is this idea of rent seeking. Now, rent seeking was introduced, of course, there's a lot of literature on that as well, which dates back to Tolog, a public choice theorist. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his works. He said that, well, the cost of rent seeking to the society is not limited by, just there is a monopoly or there is regulations being imposed and they, impose very insignificant cost to the society. The cost is very high because according to Tolog, well, he refutes a lot of other theories before him, but then his core idea is that it's not only that a regulator and the polity join hands, which is not in the best interest of the society, but then since there is only one rent at the end of the day to be grabbed, and because several parties are competing to achieve that rent, and in that process of getting access to that rent, a lot of them are spending real time and resources. Now, those are the actual cost of rent seeking to the society, because the cost of that rent seeking is massive to the society. But then this theory also largely applies to the context of Western economies, where we have strong institutions, a strong rule of law. How about countries like Afghanistan? We don't have enough, industrial sort of mode of production, strong industries versus the government, but we have interest groups, the nature and, the kind of games that those interest groups are playing and the platforms on which they are playing their games is completely different. Now, I identified three, from the broader history of Afghanistan, at least the history of modern Afghanistan. In this paper, I identify three core interest groups. One is, of course, de jure rulers, the states, from monarchs to presidents. We all know that they maintained a very exclusive order in Afghanistan. And the idea of property right as very broad and important economic institution was largely undefined for a long time in Afghanistan. And if it was defined at some point, it was not properly implemented by any of the de jure rulers in Afghanistan. So a lot of those state rulers, we know that they engaged in a form of very loosely one-sided relationship with the society, where they would extract a lot of resources from the society, but in return, they had nothing very less to give back to the society in terms of services. But one factor which distinguishes de jure rulers from what I call de facto or informal order in Afghanistan is this idea that, at least speaking in relative terms, a lot of them, they demonstrated a progressive outlook as compared to what I call de facto rulers or informal players of the game in Afghanistan. While they demonstrated a progressive outlook, but the sort of policies that they put forward, the sort of institutions that they tried to install, they were very much self-serving, serving the interests of the ruler itself. So the first de jure ruler, the second is, of course, the traditional authority, like clergy, the tribal chieftains, khans and maliks, who ruled over informal institutional base, mosque, madrasa, and jirga, as the broader informal institutions in Afghanistan. Of course, their source of legitimacy was these informal institutional base, the Sharia law, the culture and tribal codes of behavior. And because of their popular loyalty that they enjoyed from the public, from vast majority of rural Afghanistan, they were often treated as parties by the de jure rulers. And in virtue of their vast popular reality, they received rents from de jure rulers. And that is, this is how I bring in the idea of rent as a lubricant between various interest groups in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, this traditional authority, they emerged both as a source of institutional inertia in Afghanistan and as a source of, discontinuous institutional change across the history of modern Afghanistan. And the third category of special influence groups is emerging sociopolitical elites and parties, starting from early 20th century with the Jamiat al-Sari Darbar, or the Secret Association of the Court, and sometime in the mid 20th century they expand into left, right. We have multiple factions and groups and parties. So that is the third major influence group. Now, is the third interest group very much distinct from the second, the traditional authority? The answer is yes and no. Yes, in certain cases like the PDPA, the entire left people who sort of broke away from the tradition, from the clergy, and the equation of relationship between them were sort of animosity instead of some sort of relationship. But then in certain other cases, like the Mujahideen and a lot of Islamists, they were, of course, very much identical to the traditional authority. But eventually, I think it doesn't harm to categorize them as a separate interest group in Afghanistan. So I have here a graph which I put these three different interest groups into a trajectory, into a spectrum. So as far as institutional change and reforms are concerned, on the one end of the spectrum to the right, I have modern sociopolitical elite. The left, people like Amanullah Khan, the Jamiat al-Sari Darbar, Terzi, and all the groups that he influenced, who are strong advocates of reform in Afghanistan. But then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the traditional authority, which of course resist any reform, because those reforms sort of they are perceived as attempts to discontinue or distort the rent that the traditional authority enjoyed for quite a long time. Now, the traditional authority's definition, in my analysis, is very comprehensive. It includes clergy, and it includes also sardars, the influential cousins of the kings and amirs who enjoyed a lot of rents from the state. But then in the middle ground of the spectrum, of course, there's the de jure rulers who are sort of trying to, pick a middle ground and an optimal decision between the traditional authority on the one side, who resist any sort of reform, and the modernists on the other. But in a lot of times, we saw that they couldn't maintain that balance, which eventually led to the fall of a lot of regimes in Afghanistan.
You have 3 minutes.
All right. So jumping to the main conclusions of the paper. So the main idea that I'm trying to put forward in the paper is, that's what the model gives us, is that, well, the cost of rent seeking in contexts like Afghanistan is much bigger than what we have in the established literature in economics and public choice. While the Tolak idea is that, well, the cost of rent seeking to the society is this entire resources that are wasted in the process of competition to grab a particular chunk of rent, which is out there in the society, in the form of a favorable regulation or a monopoly in a particular industry. That's it. So that's what we have in the established literature. But then when we analyze contexts like Afghanistan and, influence groups that I just described, and, very complex layers of formal and informal institutions coexisting and at some time conflicting each other, then of course the social cost in this context is very much high. So the first one that I identify is loss of long-term economic growth through loss of capital accumulation. Now, governments in this context, of course, they resort to rent allocation strategies for their vital political objectives. Now, a small coalition of unproductive elites who that draws members from both the traditional authority and from the de jure rulers and perhaps from the middle ground guys. They are forming a very fragile coalition, but the coalition is lived based on the rent that they are extracting and redistributing amongst each other. Now, that rent comes from external sources, from very domestic and productive segments of the economy, like the commerce, like the agriculture, but then that's redistributed to these, sardars and clergies and de jure rulers. Now, since the amount of that rent is very significant, what that causes, that kills the incentive for the productive sectors of the economy, like commerce, like manufacturers, like peasants in traditional Afghanistan, they simply do not have enough incentive to produce, to engage in productive activities. Because when a bulk of their rent, the profit that they generate is extracted and redistributed among these elite groups, then of course, there is not enough economic incentives for them to accumulate capital and engage in productive activities. So when that sense of capital accumulation is killed, of course, your long-term economic growth is questioned. So that's one channel of the long-term effect of rent seeking. The second one is institutional inertia, or persistence of rudimentary and very weak and what Asimov calls bad quality institutions in the long term. Now, perpetuated rent system, of course, it reinforces the influence of the traditional and conservative members of the elite groups, the traditional authority in this case. And on the one hand side, and on the other hand, the overtaxed citizen and the diverted resources from the public expenditure erodes any trust on formal institutions. On the one side, we have the traditional authority getting, much more influence, much more access to rent because of the virtue of their, relationship to the society and the jure rulers. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have the overtaxed citizen, which sort of distorts the relationship with the formal institution, and then the ground is open for the informal order to get much more influence in the society. So when the informal order gets more influence over the formal institution, of course, then the long-term legitimacy of formal order erodes, and then on the other side, we have informal systems that permeate the social life, the economic life, and even exerts a lot of influence on the political life of the country. And this, at the end of the day, vanishes prospects for creative destruction and the rise of modern institution of the capitalist system or effective institution, as a matter of fact. And the third and last channel of influence is the effect of external rent and long-term dependency. External rent, of course, triggers utilization of systems and bureaucracy for allocating rent instead of producing rent. When instead of having to produce something, you just simply get it from external sources, that has been the case throughout the history of Afghanistan. Of course, there is no incentive whatsoever in the part of the government to encourage productive activities. And this extends the life of extractive orders that are incapable and who are ruled by corrupt elites, and a synergistic relationship between external rent and extractive formal institution introduces a sort of feedback loop between the two. Where the flow of external rent lowers ruler dependence on domestic resources and productive activities, thus reform and accountability is, sort of killed in society. On the other side, the persistence of extractive institution in turn extends, state rentierism in the long term. As a result, the country remains in a long-term frontier path of state institutional building. And that long-term frontier path is, of course, a path toward more influence for the informal order against the formal system in the economy. The cumulative effect of these three channels of effect is, of course, something that I call the stagnated growth effect of rent seeking in the context of Afghanistan. And throughout the modern history of Afghanistan, I believe that this system of rent seeking has existed no matter what type of regime we have had. And the reason that we couldn't grow our economy or we sacrificed long-term economic development is, I think, the best channel to explain that is to see how institutions evolve. Now, what kind of institutions evolve? Of course, that is more influence for the informal order and less influence and reform of the formal system. And that's because of the vast system of rent seeking influenced by both extractive domestic system and external rent sources from outside the world. So I conclude there, and if we have time, I'm happy to discuss the
Thank you very much, Mirwais. John, it's a very important topic.